There we go. Good morning. We are carrying on, as you will have gathered, our series in Genesis. And for those of you who are about done, the good news is we're nearly there. We're nearly there. Our journey through Genesis 1 to 11 is almost at an end. Next week we will do a review of all that we've seen in Genesis 1 to 11. And we'll look at some of the themes that we've come across in this series. But I'm hoping that you're already beginning to notice some things that as we read stories like this, we go, wait a minute, I think we've heard something a little bit like that before. Maybe. And we would love you to join us next week after the service for lunch. We had a brilliant conversation the last time. And I'm sure you have questions about it. In fact, I know you've got questions because some of you have sent them to me already. And we'll have a great time having a conversation around that stuff. Well, we left off last week with the flood. If you weren't here, it was dead simple and straightforward. There's nothing to worry about it. It was simple. I would go back and listen to it, not because the sermon's particularly brilliant, but because there's actually a lot of really important information for how we think about what the flood is and how we understand some of what it is to say that God judges, and in the midst of that, there is mercy. And so that was really the whole point of last week, is that there was this sense of God's judgment coming, but even in the midst of God's judgment, there was grace and there was mercy, and God made a covenant with Noah, which is what the famous rainbow is, the sign of the covenant and all that kind of stuff. And that's what we spent last week looking at. And importantly for today, when the flood had come to an end and when they were leaving the ark, we get these verses, Genesis 9 and verse 1. It says this, "Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth.'" And that's repeated again in verse 7. And God says, "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it." And so this is the charge that's given to Noah. And of course, everybody realizes that as soon as you read that, you go, that sounds a lot like what God said to Adam and Eve. It's very similar. And so we get this renewal of the purpose of humanity, which is to go forth, to multiply, and to fill the earth, to inhabit the whole earth. That's part of our created mandate. And that's going to become important for today. So, I want us to understand the chronology of how we get from Genesis chapter 9 to where I just had Duncan read in Genesis 11. There is, of course, in between... Well done! Duncan's paying attention. We've got Genesis 10. I didn't have Duncan read Genesis 10 because it's another one of the long extended genealogies, which is really fascinating. And maybe somebody has a question next week and we could get really excited about what we find in the genealogy. But it's titled in lots of Bibles, The Table of Nations. And this is how Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, then go and have their own families and spread out throughout the earth. But it really matters that we understand the chronology of this. Because we've got Genesis 9 finishes with them coming off the boat, and then Genesis 10, it's not the boat, the ark, sorry. Genesis 10 then lays out all of these families that grow from the three sons of Noah. And then Genesis 11 tells us the story of the Tower of Babel. However, if we pay attention in our reading of Genesis 10, we discover in three parts, in verse 5 of chapter 10, it says, this is talking about the Japhethites, the descendants of Japheth, says, "From these the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language." And then in verse 20, it says, this is talking about Ham. "These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations." And then finally in verse 31, it says, "These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages in their territories and nations." Now we then start chapter 11 that Duncan read for us, and it says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech." Okay, so what's going on here? right? These are the things that we notice when we pay attention to the reading. So what's going on? So I want us to think about it like this. We've got the story of the flood, so we've got Noah's story, and then we get the story that says, here's what happens after that. Here's all the sons of Noah. Here's them actually being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth as they were commanded to do so. And so that fills out. And then chapter 11 then jumps back to one specific moment in time. Because we get this point that, wait a minute, they're all speaking different languages. How did that happen? Because the three of them came out the boat together, presumably speaking the same language with three brothers. How did we get there? And so the text jumps us back into a particular point in the story and begins to tell us about the Tower of Babel, and that will also explain where the languages have come from. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. We're learning. It's good, isn't it? And so we find that. So where does it take us back into the story? Well, it's not entirely clear, but most commentators for most of history have understood it, that it would come back into Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8, really. Cush was the father of Nimrod. What a name. We're going to come back to him. Who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, and Shinar. Okay. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Resen, and which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Okay, this is where Babel arrives, we think. Nimrod is the guy that's kind of in charge of making this happen. So we've jumped back into the story there, and then that's where we get all these languages being separated and the division that comes. It's worth mentioning a couple of things about Nimrod. Cool name, except it means the rebellious one, or rebelling against God. And we once again encounter in the story a man of violence. He was a mighty warrior. Is not a good description. I think we think of that as going, oh, he must be the cool guy, right? He's the mighty warrior. Actually, he's a man of violence. And we've discovered some things along the way about men of violence already. And what is this man of violence about to do? Well, he builds cities. Have we encountered a man of violence who built a city in this story already? Who? Before Lamech? Cain. There we go. So, violent men build cities, is what we've discovered. Interesting. And if we had time, we would do a whole bit. Maybe you want to ask about this next week, but there's a whole bit about what is God saying about the city and violence and all of that stuff. There's a guy called Jacques Ellul who's written some really fascinating stuff about that, and I'll bore you to tears next week if you're interested in asking about that, but we're going to park it for today. So we've got this guy Nimrod, and he is building cities and building this place called Babel. I'm just trying to remember what order I put my slides in, because I think I might have got this bit wrong, and this is off. I thought it was your fault. It's definitely mine. There we go. Okay, here we go. A map. Some people like a map. This is where we are in the world. We're in the Middle East. This is the where we get the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers coming down. And this is where Babylon is. This whole orange area, this is Shinar, the valley of Shinar, that's referred to both in Nimrod's story in chapter 10 and at the very beginning of our text in verse 1 in chapter 11. If we zoom in a little bit more, you can see this is the kind of area that we're talking about. And this, of course, gives rise to Babylon. Babylon will be the people who conquer, ultimately, the southern part of Israel, Judah, and carry them off into exile, and where we get the stories of Daniel and then Jeremiah and people like that are all in Babylon. There. Okay? That makes sense? Okay. What's my next slide? Yeah, that's okay. You can see that one. Okay, what are we going to say about this story? It begins with them saying, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Now, that might not seem like much, but this is an unbelievable technological breakthrough. This is of the level of the internet being involved. Okay? If you are a group of people who take stone to build your buildings, then you have a real limitation on what you can do. What is that limitation? The limitation is, what is the shape of the stone? What's it like? What's its properties? How easy is it to work with? Mortar doesn't do very well if it gets wet. There's all sorts of issues with that. And so you're limited in what you can do if you are a Hebrew living in Palestine. And so your buildings are all going to be low-rise, and they're going to be built with stones and with mortar, okay? And so if most likely where the readers of this are in that part of the world, that's what they were building with, and why that explanatory note is in there. However, if we then think about this, which is that they used brick instead of stone, what does it mean? Well, they've technologically decided we can actually learn how to make bricks. Bricks are of a common size, and they can be made on an industrial scale, which begins to allow them to be creative and to build things like cities and big structures. Now, this is part of the created order. We are made to be creative people. This is what we talked about in Genesis 1 and 2, right? Part of the image-bearingness of God is for us to be creative people. Technology is a good thing for the most part. The only question is, what will we use it for? This is back to the question that we get asked right at the beginning in Genesis chapter 2. Will they use it for good or for evil? They are now people who have the knowledge of good and evil. What will they choose? Are we surprised what the outcome is? No, they choose evil. They choose to decide to build something their way rather than with one that trusts with God. So they begin to build a city. And there's no doubt that in this city, there's some remarkable things being built. And among them, we're told, is a tower that is being built in the midst of this city. And so this city will look something like this. Enormous, great big city. Now, this is not an actual picture from 4,000 years ago. Michael might have cool cameras. There were no cameras back then. Their technology had only gone as far as bricks. But this is the kind of thing that we look at. So I want you to remember something that it's described as being in the plain of Shinar. So this is a massive flat area, okay? And we have this huge temple right in the middle, okay? And they've built this city for people to live there. Let's think just a bit about this city. What's going on in this? Part one is something of the image of God. It's creative. It uses great resources well. They've invented technology. It's a huge part of what it means to be made in the image of God. However, there's something of the fall, because there's the desire to reach for God, and we'll talk more about that in the temple in just a moment. But also, there's disobedience here. They were given one command. What was the command? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Okay? If you decide to cobble together and collect together, that is not filling the earth. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's saying, no, we found a little spot here that we like ourselves. We're going to build this for ourselves. And actually, we can look after ourselves. And the other part that comes with that command was a promise. And that promise from God was this in Genesis 9, verse 3. Everything that lives and moves about, try that again. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. God's saying, I am giving you an abundance. And they're saying, I tell you what, let's gather together, let's collect together, and we can look after ourselves. We don't need to trust God. The city in Genesis so far has only ever been a symbol of human reliance on themselves. They don't trust the divine promise. They think they'll look after themselves. messed that part out. So what about this temple? Oh, gone the wrong way. This is probably what it looked like. It's called a ziggurat. A ziggurat is basically a Mesopotamian pyramid that looks roughly like that. In terms of size, we're talking about 90 meters in new money. It's about 300 feet or so in old money, as a square on the base, and about the same in height. Now, for us today, like a building that's the best part of 100 meters tall is still quite tall, but frankly, it's not that tall, right? We've all seen much taller buildings than that, right? If you lived 4,000 years ago and you lived on a flat plain and there was a man-made structure that stretched 100 meters in the air, you would be dumbfounded by the thing. And you'd see it from everywhere. It would be the center point of what you could see. The Tower of Babylon represented a political and religious ideology that declared that this empire is the meeting place of heaven and earth. Why is that? Because you see all those stairs, they go all the way up and they wind it up, and that's a temple on the top. This was the place that was to be where you met with God. And the origin story of Babylon, as they tell their own version of it, is that they understand the word Babel in their language, Akkadian, to mean the gate of the gods. This is the place where you met with the gods. And so this temple, or this tower, is built in order to be this place where they connect with the gods, or with God. And it had a purpose. It was for the gods to come down. Here, look, we've made a way for you to come to earth. We've made a way that you can come to this place. Now, let's be clear. The presence of God is a good thing, and there's a way for us to tell the Genesis story that it's all about the presence of God. And we could draw a little picture again with the cosmos and Eden in the very center, the Garden of Eden in the very center of it. And this is the place where God dwells. And the longing to get back there is something in our human nature. That's a good thing. But these guys want to control it. They're not saying God has said we will work this way. But actually, they're saying, I tell you what, let's build this thing, and then we can control how the gods come and interact with us, or how God comes and interacts with us. This is what they're trying to do, I think, with this ziggurat that we discover here. It was built and rebuilt over many times and remained a huge thing in Babylon for a very, very long time. And that's, again, back to our piece there. Why do they build this? The text tells us, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we can make a name for ourselves. So that we can make a name for ourselves. This is, again, about being in control. This isn't the modern idea of I want to make a name for myself. I want a reputation. I want to be famous. I want to be known. This is about being in control. In the same way the tower seeks to control how God comes into this world, this is their expression of we want to be the ones in control. This is our world and we're running it. I'm going to put a quote up. Some of you are just going to freak out because you can't read it because it's too long. I'll send these notes out so you can have a look at it. This is from a book called Biblical Critical Theory by a guy called Christopher Watkin. If you're a nerd like me, it is one of the best theology books that's been written in the last couple of decades. It's amazing. Here's what he says about the building of the tower. The people want to assert their own autonomous identity, captured in the language of so that we may make a name for ourselves. In biblical thinking, to name something is to have authority over it. We saw this, of course, in Genesis 1. God systematically names the elements of creation as he makes them. And commensurate with the mandate for humanity to have dominion under God, Adam names the animals. We remember that from doing Genesis 1 and 2. To seek to make a name for oneself is to assert one's self-made autonomous independence. To claim once again to be the master of my fate, the captain of my soul, and to ignore the one who gives you life, breath, and everything. To say they're building this tower to make a name for themselves is to say, we're in control of this whole shooting match. There is no God who matters. We're in control. This is about us, about me. And I hope you're beginning to see why this story matters for the world that we live in today. The creed of modern secularism, I or we, are self-governing. Humans are the measure of everything that is right and wrong. I or we are self-determining. Humans set their own destiny with no other reference point. I or we are self-sufficient. Humans can handle all the crisis of life given enough time and the right circumstances. By our technological advances, we can achieve social stability and flourishing. This is the creed of modern secularism. We're self-governing, we're self-determining, we're self-sufficient. We can do it all ourselves. We have made a name for ourselves. I think the author Mark Sayers puts it brilliantly when he says that this modern secular creed is the desire to have the kingdom without a king. It's the desire for a kingdom without a king. The idea that humanity can create a utopian ideal all of its own. And we look around our world and see how that's true today. But ultimately, we see the failure of it, because what happens is that powerful, violent men take hold of it, and it usually is men, and others are dispossessed and marginalized. That's what happens here. And that's what's happening in Babel. It's the same story. We can take control of everything. We will build a city. And it's built with violence. Genesis 1-11 says this creed of modern secularism is a nonsense. It doesn't work because humans have always behaved like this. And so what will God do? Well, the author, first of all, has a little joke with us. He says, but the Lord came down to see the city. I love this. It's so good. Like, we built this incredible thing, right? Humanity, incredible, creative peace. Look at this. We built this big tower. And the God who we've just been reading about, separating the waters from the waters, and the one who separated the land from the waters, and then the one who on the land made living creatures, he has to come all the way down from the heavens to see this city they built. Oh, I wonder what it's like. It's remarkable. It's funny. I think it's how we're supposed to read that. And the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Does this ring a bell for anyone? What does it remind us of? Sorry? Yeah, okay. You jumped ahead, but yes, very clever. Yeah. But does it remind us of anything from the story we've had already? Let me read this for us. Genesis chapter 3. And I've now lost my place. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us. We've got that one of us language again. Knowing good and evil, he must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. Our text this morning, the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. It's another banishment. It's another exiling from the land. Why is God doing that? Why is God doing that? Well, because if this text is about human autonomy and the desire for humans to do life apart from God, then really what God's saying is, look, if they are so committed to this, they are going to try and build a life that is completely separate from us. And we will not be able to stop that. So, let us stop that. We will bring confusion to their languages and save them having to do this. And we are indeed, as my notes say, going to return to this in our Pentecost series, as it will be hard not to think of Pentecost as the undoing of the judgment of Babel and the complexities of that, and a scattering that then goes on. And it's brilliant. It's like hyperlinks all over the place here to the New Testament. And so our text finishes. From there, the Lord scattered them over the whole face of the earth. Now, we've been doing Genesis for long enough that we've seen the patterns, right? The pattern is this. God blesses, people do something wrong, God judges, and then what? We find grace, new grace, right? There's new grace comes. Where's our new grace? From there, the Lord scattered them over the whole face of the earth. End of our narrative section, and back to another genealogy. We go back to the genealogy of Shem, and you're like, hold on a second, we just had the genealogy of Shem. What's going on with that? Well, as with all family trees, there are different routes you can take through a family tree. So this one gives us a second route through the family tree and takes us to a guy called Abram and his wife Sarai. Where is the new grace with the scattering? It's in Abram and Sarai. Because we're back to, where is the seed of the woman? This is our question that we've had since the fall, since Genesis 3. The question is, this seed of the woman that will crush the head of the snake, where evil will be undone and all of that. Where is the seed of the woman? Where is the seed of... We've lost it. Is it gone? They're all being scattered with Abram and Sarai. The hope lives. This is the new grace. And indeed, we will see, if we were to do Genesis chapter 12, and I will touch on this next week as part of our summary. But for now, it's worth noticing that God chooses out Abram, calls him to go somewhere. He says this, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Follow me, says God. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. Listen to this. I will make your name great. Hold on, what's going on there? Well, we've just had people get judged because they wanted to make their name great, and now God's saying, I will make your name great. What's the difference? God does one of them. Humans are trying to do the other one. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And here's the point. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is the seed of the woman's story gone through one family. And of course, the hope might live, but we've already been told in chapter 11, verse 30 about Sarai. Now, Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Hold on, God, what are you doing? How is it that the seed of the woman is going to continue when you seem to have made a mistake and chosen a couple that can't have kids? And frankly, the outworking of that is the entirety of the Abraham story and perhaps a whole lot more. But what does it mean? Do you remember we went back to when Eve first had Cain and it was like, I made this. Okay. We've now got to a point in the story where Sarai can't make anything. And God's saying, I have a way. I have a way. You will not rely on yourself for this to come to pass. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I will undo all of this confusion. I've just made all these nations so that they won't be blessed, so that they'll be confused and struggling. That's the judgment. And the new grace, I have called one out who will, as a result of his line, all the peoples will be blessed. This is the outcome. This is the outworking of Genesis 11 and into 12. And our great hope for the future, the follow-on of the Genesis 3 promise of the one who will crush the head of the snake, is now firmly set in the family of Abram. Okay, so what are we to do with all of that? What difference does that make to you and me living in Portobello today? Well, it seems to me that the challenges of Babel are the challenges that we face today. There's challenges of violence, there's a challenge to self-autonomy, there's a challenge to say, let's just huddle together and we'll fix it. Let's just trust in technology and we can do remarkable things. The future is bright. The future will be fine. It will all be okay. We can fix all the problems because we're humans and we're geniuses and we're clever and we can make things happen and we work together and everybody's all one people. And it doesn't work out like that at all, does it? Because we're fighting wars all over the place and we've got evil that just seems to rise to the top, and powerful, violent men take control once again. And we could sit here and I could finish this sermon by having a look at some of the awful things we see in the world and going through and saying, look, this is how we see it in Genesis 11 and Genesis 3. And it wouldn't be hard for us. There's a whole story of that we actually missed out the part in Genesis chapter, at the end of chapter 9, where this weird thing goes on with Noah and with his son. And we could talk about that while the kids are out, because it's definitely an adult story. And we could think about, well, we've got all this Epstein Files stuff going on, which is just awful. And actually, does this have something to say? Yes, it does. We could have a look at where violence comes from through Cain and Nimrod and people like that, and we could look at the world that we see up here and say it has something to say to the way that the world is today. We could look at Eve and her striving to grasp hold of what it is to be God, and we could consider those people that own these AI companies and think about that. This has a lot to say about the way the world is, but I want to invite us this morning to think a bit more personally. The question here, I think, in this story of Genesis chapter 11 is, will we walk in obedience to the simple things God has called us to? Will we walk in obedience to the simple things God has called us to? Be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth was their simple command. Jesus has said to us some simple commands. Follow me. Be my witnesses. And we could go on and on. What are the simple things that God has called us to? That the challenge is, will we walk in obedience to those? This is the personal bit. Or will we try to make a name for ourselves? Will we continue to assert our own autonomous identity, as Christopher Watkin puts it? Will we build a world in which we invite God, but only on our terms? We build our own ziggurat. It says, God, I'll meet with you, but only if you come the way that I decide that you're supposed to do. Will I try to create a name for myself with my very successful career and the way that people from all around can look and see how successful I am? Will I use my access to technology so that people think I'm great? Or will I trust the promise of God that he will take care of me? This, I think, is the question of Genesis 11 for us today. It does talk to all these big things, and I'd love to have a conversation about all these big areas and that Genesis 1 to 11 talks to us about. But this morning, I think it's worth us just pausing for a moment. Will you walk in obedience to the simple things God has called you to? Will you try to create a name for yourself? Which of these two routes will you take? The narrow path or the broad path? Take a moment to think about that.